Hello and welcome to the Online Strength Coach Podcast, episode 112, Linear Programming, How, When, and Where to Use it. Okay, so this is based off a question that I got via Facebook Messenger, basically asking on the topic, what we're talking about, how and when to use linear programming and when it's appropriate to do so. So just a little bit of background if you're not aware, although I'm sure most of you will be, on what linear programming is. Linear programming is basically a set time frame with an end goal. So a typical one, or one of the most popular programs that I have ever put out, is the 5-week template that I did based off Ed Cohen's 10-week training towards a big meet or a big competition. And basically what it is, it's the end of 5 weeks, you're going to be able to do this 3x3 workout at 90%. Which is the start of the program you will not be able to do because you haven't done the volume or haven't done the training stimulus to be able to peak towards that training. So linear training in essence is when you start through a period of high volume and lower intensity, and then week to week you use some kind of decrement or some kind of set increase in intensity and some set decrease in volume. So for instance, this 5-week program, week 1 is 3 sets of 10 at 75%, so you have a volume of 30 at 75% intensity. Week 2 is 3 sets of 8 at 78%, so you've lost 6 reps and added 3% to the intensity. Week 3 is 3 sets of 6 at 83.5%, so you've lost another 6 reps, but now you've jumped up 5.5%. Week 4, in my version of the program, it's a bit more of a volume, so it's a bit less linear, but it's 4 sets of 4, so you lose 2 reps, and it's at 88%, so you gain another 4.5% in intensity. And then week 5, which is the final week of the program, is 90% at 3 sets of 3, so you lose 7 reps, and you gain 2% intensity. But when you start getting towards 90%, it's more of a limit weight or limit workout. So you can use this program in 2 ways. If you're more of a beginner lifter or you're a more of a novice lifter, you can probably use it to get some PBs. So say you're squatting 140 and you want to squat 150, it's very feasible to run this cycle and to achieve that goal, achieve that outcome. If you're a novice lifter, you can use like a 10-week elongated version of this program where there's 2 weeks of 10s, 2 weeks of 8s, etc., etc., where one is an easier workout, one's a tougher workout. So maybe you do 2 sets of 10 at 70% week 1, 2 sets of 10 at 75% week 2. That's kind of the original Ed Cohen version of the program. Again, it's with the knowledge that I want to be able to lift this on this date. So for the next 10 weeks, this is my training plan, or these are my training outcomes that I want. Now, linear training, to be honest, pretty much underscores all meet training. There's no real true non-linear training. If training is non-linear, or there are no non-linear elements to the training, then training is unplanned, and therefore it is not periodized training. So if we look at something like undulating training, so you have daily undulating, weekly undulating, which was kind of sexy for a little while. There's still some form of linear nature to that program. So the more typical version of the undulating, or the version of the daily undulating training that is present in the research, or the limited research that's been done on it in the Journal Strength and Conditioning Research, is basically you have a heavy workout, which might be, say, 3 sets of 3. You have lighter volume-based workout, which might be 5 sets of 5 at a starting point of, say, 65, 70%. And then you'll have a hypertrophy workout, which is typically 3 sets of 10 at 60 to 70%. So that laid out might be 3 sets of 3 on the heavy workout of 85% or greater. On the lighter workout, or the volume-based workout, and what gets termed as the power workout in some of the programs people try to sell this concept, will be 5 sets of 5 at like 70 to 80%. And then the volume, or the hypertrophy workout, or the size workout, will typically be about 3 sets of 10 at 60 to 70%. And that's that is the daily undulating model. However, that is linear in nature, as we will either progress it by starting with higher volume on week one in the workouts, and maybe week two reduce the volume, up the weight, so on and so forward, or the volume remains stagnant and we just try to up the weight as we do. Another form of linear training, something like starting strength, which is a linear form of training, but it is linear increase in is just a linear increase in intensity and therefore is very poor periodization. It's a decent program for a beginner because it gets them lifting weights. It's simple to understand, it's simple to do, but it is a very poorly periodized program. It doesn't vary. It doesn't have set targets. It doesn't work with. Doesn't manipulate training variables at all. It's just the same workout, the same sets of exercises done as heavy as you can every week, which is fine for a novice, but for a more advanced lifter, is a very poor way of training. So linear training underpins pretty much all the training I do. So for powerlifters, the powerlifters I train, I tend to utilize weekly undulation. Um, so I use Boris Shiko's framework of 3 power lifts in a session, like alternating upper body and lower body. So you may have 2 bench variations and 1 squat variation in the program. The squat variation is done between the bench variations, so you get a rest. You might do 2 deadlift variations and a bench variation. So again, when you go from one deadlift variation to the next, you have bench in between, which allows for a rest. Tend to work at a minimum of 4 sets per exercise and a maximum of about 10. And those sets and reps are all varied. So one of my kind of staple workouts that I'll utilize is 2 sets of 5 at 70%, 2 sets of 4 at 75%, 2 sets of 3 at 80%, and that's a fairly standard volume-based workout that I'll do. An intensity-based version of that workout, again, just a simple pyramid, might be 2 sets of 4 at 70%, 2 sets of 3 at 80%, 2 sets of 2 at 90% is an example of a volume-based, or sorry, a more intensity-based version of that workout. And what we'll do over a 4-week period is we'll start with week 1 as the highest volume. Week 2 has a reduction in volume but an increase in intensity. Week 3 is the second highest volume of the block. Intensity drops a little bit, and then week 4 is the lowest amount of intensity the highest amount of intensity with the lowest amount of volume. And then typically that first week tends to have a fairly low average intensity, somewhere around 67%. Whereas a heavy week, depending if it's just a training cycle, the average intensity might be around 75 to 78%. If it's a meet cycle, basically, if you're like 3 weeks out, it might get up to about 83, 85%, where we're doing like singles and we're going up to 95% just to kind of see where we're at. But that is a linear block. It's just a more complicated linear block than the 5-week block that I laid out beforehand. The principles are still linear. We chop and change. And basically, from the Boris Shiko seminar, when he was explaining why he doesn't recommend linear training, he was saying if you have a 24-week linear program, the way good linear programs are designed, you need to complete every week of training sequentially to be able to gain the fitness to actually see out the program. So for instance, on that 5-week block or that 5-week program that we talked about, that the hardest workout really are the workout that induces the work capacity or induces the overload that allows us to see out the rest of those sessions is the 3 sets of 10 at 75%. 75% on its own is around 10 repetition maximum weight. You can maybe do a little bit more, maybe like 76, 77%, but on a calculator or the Brzezinski equation, which is most commonly used and, to my knowledge, most accurate 1RM equation, it's 75% is your 10 rep. The thing is, though, with 10 rep weight is there's leeway. So you've ever seen the 20 rep squat program, you'll know that you begin with your 10 rep max. So you begin with a weight that you can do for 10 weights and no more. You basically just stand out and do more reps with it. And then eventually with time that turns into 20 rep weight, then you up the weight and blah, blah, blah. That is also a linear program, but as discussed before, is a non-periodized or poorly programmed linear program. Yeah, so on that 5 week linear block, that 3x10 workout's a hefty workout. It's where you're gonna create some overload. That induces a stress. The adaptation from that stress gives us some stimulus, a small increase in fitness, and that small increase in fitness allows us to do a 3x8 workout, and so on and so forth. Within that workout, probably week 3, the 3x6 workout, and week 5, the 90% workout, they're probably the lightest weeks. The two overload weeks, if you will, would be week 1 and week 4, and it's structured to be that way. The only real linear block per se is like week 1 to 3, or the linear element of that program, week 1 to 3, where we have like a fairly steady increase in intensity and a steady decrease in volume. And that's I designed it into that block to have that higher volume week on week 4 to allow it to be more replicable, to allow it to be a template or a program that can be used more than once. Typically, you'll be able to do linear cycles maybe once or twice a year and get a good result. And it's not necessarily something you don't want to do. It just they have a limited lifespan. So for the Edinburgh barbell lifters leading into the Eastern District, not leading into the Eastern Districts, they did what was about a 6 week linear phase of training where we tried to set a 10 rep max at the start of the program. Then we did a volume week where we just worked on a lot of variations, average intensity of about 70 to 85%. Week 3, looked to set an 8 rep PB. Week 4, some volume. Week 5, try to set a 6 rep PB, and so on and so forth until we got down to 2 reps. So it was probably more of a 10 week program, And over that stage, because most of the people at the barbell club are novices, people will set some pretty big PBs. But that's a linear program. It's interspersed with volume, so it's more sustainable. So it's not we're not maxing, we're not peaking, we're not deliberately trying to decrease fitness to allow performance to rise, which is what a peak is. When we reduce fatigue over time, typically for strength qualities or speed qualities, 10 days is the optimal amount of time to taper, and that's when we reduce volume, really melt away volume exponentially, and keep intensity to a maintenance level over 2 weeks or 3 weeks even for some tapers. And that's why you feel amazing at a meet, and then after the meet you feel like hammered shit. It's because your fitness drops off a cliff because you don't keep up the volume or you don't keep up the training stimulus. So that's why my programs now or linear cycles that I put together now always have volume interspersed from the linear element. But there's always a linear element to my program. There maybe over like a 12-month phase of training, there won't be a linear element. But certainly within kind of the micro cycle or on the macro cycle. So the macro cycle is the year-long period of training, so it's your annual plan. There won't necessarily be a linear plan throughout the entire year. However, on the mesocycle level, so the 8 to 12 week level of programming, there will be linear elements to the program. Typically, you'll have a high one block or one phase of high volume work with some more limited intensity, and then you'll have like an 8 week period where we'll flip flop between intensity and volume, look to push the boundaries. Well, then there will be linear elements towards that. What I won't do normally is I won't set goal weights or goal. I won't say in 12 weeks we want to squat this, we want to lift this, we want to lift that, because for advanced lifters or in general, it works for like limited periods, but it doesn't work sustainably. It's not really something. It's not a good way of training. It's not a good habit of training because you're always pushing your boundaries. You're always in a fatigue state. Workouts are always tough. Technique doesn't get developed as well as it can do. Lifting becomes more inefficient. Most lifters train like this, and this for me is one of the main reasons why most lifters have very poor technique, because they're constantly on strain and they're constantly trying to push the boundaries, and therefore they just basically get an acceptable technique and they just use it and burn themselves on the ground doing that, and they end up maybe getting fairly good returns for the first 3 to 5 years of training, but they ultimately don't go anywhere near the level of strength that they could have went. They took a more moderate approach, or like a linear approach with a more of a non-linear element, or more like cyclical volume, cyclical intensity. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question, and probably a bit more in depth than you were thinking. But then you probably think that watching this podcast. I'm giving a seminar in Aberdeen on Saturday, the 25th. It starts at 10 o'clock. I'll leave a link in the description so you can book in there if you're based in Aberdeen. We're basically just it's going to be a 8-hour seminar on powerlifting. We'll have practicals on all 3 lifts, and we'll have theory on the technique of all 3 lifts, and we'll also have a theory session on programming. There'll be a lot of information. It'll definitely be worth your time coming down if you're kind of thinking about it and you're in the area. Thanks very much for listening. I'll be Mark, and I'll catch you in the next episode of the Online Strength Boost podcast. Thank you for listening. Appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Bye.